All right. Uh, Welcome back after a bit of a hiatus while I was on vacation and dealing with family problems. Um, this week we're going to talk about logging in Python, and specifically we're going to focus on the Loguru module. Now, the reason I want to talk about this module as opposed to the standard Python logging is, while you can do anything you want, anything you're going to want with the Python logging module, it can be a bit of a pain to set up and to use, especially if you try and do anything sophisticated. There are, for instance, if you want to set up filters or new handlers, or you want to configure a combination of filters and handlers with specific loggers, it gets pretty tedious to set it all up and to get it working properly. So Loguru is one of a few different logging alternatives that I've seen in the wild that tries to alleviate some of these problems. Its goal is to make it easier to work with to work with logging in general. It makes the setup easier. It makes configuring additional loggers easier for most of the common cases, and hopefully streamlines the whole process. So we'll take a look at it and some of its basic features. I do know that we have a few things a few people want to talk about problems that they've had with the basic Python logging. So we'll see if or the standard library logging. We'll see if we can address those and see if Loguru helps us solve those a little bit easier. It is also compatible with the standard logger, although there is some boilerplate required in order to either get messages from Loguru into the standard logger or vice versa. And we will touch on that if we have time. I'm going to post in the chat I'm going to post in the chat the link to the Loguru Git repository, which has the documentation that I'm going to be following. And also, I would like to say that looking through the documentation, this is a well-documented module, which is always a plus. Also, Brandon has sent in feature requests and submitted bug reports, and the developers seem to be very responsive to addressing issues that are brought up and new feature requests. So that's always a plus. So let's look at a simple example. So it would be kind of nice to do like a side-by-side, like how would you do this with the standard lib logger versus how you do it with Loguru. But it takes so long to set up the logging stuff that I didn't have time to do it. So we're just going to look at some basic examples of how we cover common use cases in Logger. I've already set up 4 example files, but that doesn't cover everything that we're going to want to go over. So we'll be writing code, as is our typical modus operandi in these meetings. But I'm actually a little bit prepared, so the start will at least go faster. Okay, so in order to set up, so Loguru comes with a basic setup out of the box, so that you don't have to do, unlike the standard library logger, you don't have to configure it before you can start using it. It comes with a standard logs to standard out by default. So if you forget to call, unlike the standard lib module, you can't forget to configure it and just have it not work. So if we run this, let's see, example 1. we get our log message printed out to standard out with a pretty good default format, and I like this. So it gives us a timestamp, the logging level, the module which it came from, if it came from a function or not, the line number, and then the message. So this default behavior is much better than standard lib logging, because this is all the stuff that you want in a good logging message, and Loguru comes with that out of the box. Okay, so what if we want to do more than just log to standard out? So rather than configuring formatters and handlers and then hooking them all together as you would do in the standard library logger, in Loguru, you just have the add method. So one of the things that makes Loguru a little different from the way that the standard library logger is you don't have more than one logger. In the standard library logger, you have multiple logger objects, and there's a hierarchy that they work in, and they're related to each other. So when you log to a logger, it may or may not pass through certain handlers depending on how it's set up. In Loguru, they just toss all that out and say, okay, you have one logger object, all of your log messages are put into it, and then you add, and then there's just an add method where you add what's called a sync, and that sync will have a format, any filtering that you want, and any level filters that you want. So let's look at a few examples of that. So here we have we're adding a logger. We're adding a sync to standard error. If you give it a file-like object, it will just do the right thing. You can specify the format, and the default format, if you don't specify the format, the default format is basically this format right here. And if you look at the documentation for the add method, you can see how they did this, how they created this format. And so you'll notice that the format is also colorized. So if you look at the default argument for add format, you can see how they added the color in. And we'll touch on that briefly again if we have time. The filter, if you give it a string, it will filter to just that module. So in this case, this is a module name. If you wanted to do, you could change this to something like sub.module. And so it will limit this logger to log messages that come from modules on that particular path. And then, of course, we have the level, which specifies, we want to limit this to info messages or higher. Okay. So alternatively, we can specify a file name, and it will automatically create the file for us. We can specify the timestamp that the log was created. If we just use the curly braces time, it will, when it's resolving the file name, it will stick the timestamp as to when that log was created in the log name. And then we have some options that are specific to new file-based logging only. So we have rotation, automatically rotates the file when it reaches 500 megabytes. In this example, we can specify a time of day. So a new log file is automatically created each day at noon, or we can do once a week. We can automatically delete old log files, so we can specify retention. So that after 10 days, the old log files are thrown out. And then we have compression, so we can specify that once when the log file is closed and we're no longer writing to it, it'll automatically zip it up. So those are some simple examples of some things that we can do with our syncs that we can create. Let's see. Loguru supports F-style format strings, as opposed to the percent style logging that are the percent style substitution that you would see with the standard library logger, and that always has kind of turned people off. And I actually never use that feature in the standard library. I always like pass in a call format on the string that I'm passing in. Well, this says, well, we're just going to embrace that, and now you can put the format string tokens in your string, and then add arguments to the end of your logging call, and it will just do the right thing. So this will do a positional argument to the first instance of this this replacement token, and then feature uses the keyword argument to say, okay, we're going to replace this guy right here. It works exactly the same way as format does in on normal strings. So we also have better logging of exceptions. So one of the problems that you run into in the standard library is if you want to log an exception to if you want to log an exception using the standard library logging, you have to catch the exception and then log it, and then log the exception in the exception handler. And if you don't do that, or it raises an exception that you didn't catch, or you didn't intend to catch, or you missed, then it doesn't get logged. So Loguru adds a logger.catch decorator that wraps a function in a try except block. You think of it conceptually as wrapping it in a try except block, and now any unhandled exception that comes out of this function will get caught, logged, and then re-raised. So let's look at this example. Also, it has better exception reporting than traditional logging to than the traditional logging to standard using the standard library logger. It uses let's see. Oh, he names it. There's it's the better exceptions library that improves the output for Python exceptions. So let's go ahead and run this guy. .py. Okay. So instead of the normal exception output, we get this. An error exception has been caught in function, module, process, main process, thread, main thread. Okay. So it gives you the normal trace back. So starting with the exception was created on this line. But then it says, okay, here's where it occurred in file example. Again, this is nothing new. But now, again, in addition to it being colorized and nice, it also tells you what the variables were on the offending line at the time it failed. So also, so in this case, we can see that, yeah, X is 1, Y is 2, Z is 3, Z is -3. And so that causes a division by 0, and that causes it to fail. In this case, we have more information than we would normally in the normal exception logging, and even like just the standard dumping it to standard error, because now we know what the value of the variables are at the time it failed, on the line it failed. So now we don't have to do nearly as much rooting around to figure out what was passed in to our function to cause it to fail like this. Oftentimes it will be obscured, like we won't actually know what the variables are by looking at the logging output, because they came from a file or they came from a command line. And so all we have in our stack trace is just variable names. This, using the better exceptions module, they handle that better in Loguru. And like I say, now we don't have to do anything in particular in order to catch this. So if we take that line out, let's just do a comparison here. Yeah. So this is what we would normally get. This is a normal stack trace. So we can kind of we can figure out what's wrong because we actually have the arguments here happen to be in the stack trace. But normally that's not the case. A lot of the times that's not the case. But when we get down here to the line that actually caused it to fail, we don't know what the arguments are, so we don't know why it failed. We don't know what's wrong. So this this clears things up substantially. Okay. So that's all I have for examples. So everything else that we do, we're just going to write it on the fly. So are there any questions so far? Okay. Cool. So there is logging with color support. So let's go ahead and create a new example file here. And let's grab you. So the example they give here is actually quite nice. So we're going to just add a new logger. So we're logging to standard out. And so there's the colorize keyword argument that we can give to say, yeah, we're going to support colorized output, which I believe this defaults to true. And then when we specify our format, we can put these tags in. So green, what does level do? You know what? I'm curious. Oh, and we never actually ran example 3. So we'll catch that here. Okay. So let's see. So what does level do? You can use markup tags in the sync format. So I'm going to look at the markup tags real quick. Okay. The special tag. Okay, so this is what this is. The special tag level is transformed according to the configuration color of the logged message level. Okay, so level, basically the color changes based on what the level is for of the message. Okay, that's what's going on there. So let's test this out then. Let's see. Debug. And we can get rid of these. Otherwise it will fail. There we go. So let's give this guy a shot. Okay. So we added, so one of the things that we've done here is we now have 2 loggers going to standard out. In fact, that's, we need to remove the original standard out logger. But let's look at our particular messages, and so we can compare. So on the first line we have this is the normal sync going to standard out, and this is our special one. So you'll notice that we have the time, and so this time it must be in a different format. In fact, we'll take a glance at the default format here in a little bit. So they're using a different time format for the default. So here's what our time tag turns into from right here, and it's also in green. And then level, that changes based on the level that we specify. So info is white, debug is blue, error is red, and then critical is white with a red background. So that gives you an idea as to how the level tag changes the color of the message depending on the level. All right. You can also, so for our exception example, actually, let's see. For our exception example, we can add a logger. In addition to this method for catching exceptions, we can still do the traditional standard lib method, where we put in an exception. Let's see, 0 division error. We can also log exceptions like that. So if we are in an exception handler, we can call logger exception, and it will do basically the same thing that the standard lib does when you call log exception, where we can make sure that our exception is caught and handled properly, but it will use the improved format for logging the exception as it did before. But one side note for this is when we're adding we can add a when we add a sync, we can specify how it handles exceptions. So we can do something like this. Backtrace is true, so that will tell it to do the whole backtrace. But we can set these to false so that it will limit the output of the exception to protect sensitive data. And so let's look at backtrace and diagnose. Backtrace and diagnose. So that happens to be right here. So backtrace, whether the exception trace formatted should be extended upward beyond the catching point to show the full stack trace with the generated error. and then diagnose whether the exception trace should destroy the variable values to ease the debugging. Should be set to false in production to avoid leaking sensitive data. So they recommend setting both of these values to false in production to obfuscate what the internals for the code looks like, and any variable values, so that you don't have like a variable that's like, you know, private key or something being showing up in like a stack trace in your web framework or something like that. So, okay. What else did I want to talk about? I think there were a few things I said we were going to talk about, and then I couldn't remember what they were. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to address in example 5 was, how do we change? So by default, we have a standard out logger. So then the question becomes, how do we disable the logger that comes with? Note that you may also remove a previously added handler. Okay, so we can call remove. So there's logger add and there's logger remove. If we want to get rid of the default logger, we just call this with no arguments, and it will wipe out all the existing handlers. So this will, if we come back and run this example again, this will, now we're not doubling up on our exceptions. So one of the things I did mention is that we would look at the default format for the add method. And so this is going, let me make this a little bit bigger. Okay. And I'll highlight the important part here. So the format is actually this part right here. So, okay, so here's what they've done, is they've specified the time, instead of just saying time, they've said, okay, we're going to specify the time format. So in when you're doing a string format of a datetime object, you can specify a parameters for how to display the object. So this is actually functionality that comes from the format string tokens. So time is going to be an argument that's passed to a call to format on this format string, and it's going to say, oh, this is a datetime object. Datetime knows how to take format parameters to determine how to display itself. So so we know that, so in this case, time is going to be a datetime object. It's used to replace this, and this gets passed to the datetime format string handling. And so they've gone and specified a specific format for the datetime, so they don't get like the UTC offset and stuff like that. Then they close the green tag. The vertical bar is just put in there. They use the level tag to get the colorized level. And then they have the level gets passed into the format string. I'm not sure exactly what this format specifier does. Well, let's look. It looks like let's see. No, the colorization comes from the opening and closing tag. This is justification. So it's looks like it's, yeah, it's left justifying it and giving it 8 spaces. So it's ensures that all of these bars line up. So that's what that's going here, and that's just a generic string manipulation thing that you can do with format. It's like how you would do in C. You would specify a field width. That's what this is it's a left justified field. It's a left justified text with a field width of 8. That's what's going on there. Okay. So yeah, that's why all of these take up the same amount of space in the log messages. This is actually a good idea because it makes the logs very nice and clean. Let's see. Then in cyan, we do the name of the let's see. So this is the module name, and then the function name, both in cyan, and then the line number. Let's see. So it's kind of interesting. They are not, the colons are actually white. They are not cyan, but it's hard to tell on my terminal here. And then the message, which is colorized by the level. So that's the default formatting string, which is, I like it. I don't know if there are things that I would change it off the top of my head, but that's the kind of stuff that you can do to make a nice, clean, clean output. Oh, and colorize defaults to none, not true, and that makes sense. So this is basically detect whether or not colorization is supported and act accordingly. So if colorize is true, and then you like send your output to a file, you'll probably get like the colorize start and end tags will come out in your file, in your log file, which is not what you want. So this just says, you know, do the rational thing. If we're logging to a file, don't colorize. If we are if we're logging to like standard error, you know, do the right thing. Backtrace is true, diagnose is true. Let's see. You can turn off exception handling by setting catch defaults, if I recall. Catch. Yeah. While seeing counter, the log message should automatically be caught if true. An exception message is displayed in standard error, but the exception is not propagated to the caller, preventing your app from crashing. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so it actually affects the way that logger.catch behaves. Okay, and then there's some additional parameters for file handling, such as rotation, retention, compression. Let's see. We can delay whether or not the file is created until a log message actually happens. Oh, by default, it appends to the file. That's interesting. But yeah, that makes sense. The buffering policy is line buffered. Let's see, and then the encoding to use, which should default to UTF-8 in most cases. Okay. And then it returns, and then whenever we call add, it returns the identifier associated with this particular sync. And so if we want to remove that one explicitly, we can pass it to the remove function. Okay. So I've been rambling on here for about 40 minutes. So I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. I know Balwinder had a few things that he mentioned, troubles he had with the standard library logging. So we can go ahead and discuss those and see if this will help you get around those.
Actually, my issue was in an existing code, and it was for me it was kind of hard to navigate how the logging is working. So I was adding the messages, but they were not appearing on screen. And
Right.
then I figured out that I need to use some special flags to invoke those messages. But it was kind of a frustrating experience because you edit the code and isn't working. And
Right.
but
Right.
this seems like a pretty good way. Especially I like the when with the error message you also get the values of for the variables, which
Yeah.
um, was kind of neat.
Yeah. That so what you're mentioning there is something that uh can be a problem. So I'm not sure what was happening in your specific case, but like for instance, when you're adding code to like an existing module and say, okay, I got a log message in here, it's at a debug level, why is it never appearing? And you have to look at like what filters are set up, because in the standard library, the modules that are using the logging module really don't have any control over what happens to their log messages. Basically, you're just casting them to the wind and hoping somebody picks them up.
Okay.
And and that can be, and that it sounds like that's what you were running into, is that there was no handler set up, or there was a filter set up somewhere that was catching your log messages and eating them.
Yeah, it was something like that. Then I talked with somebody, and he told me to use some special flags. And
Okay.
then I was getting a lot of output, and in that output, I had to find my messages.
Right, right. Yeah. And so they had, what it sounds like they'd done is they had, like, you're talking about like command line flags.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what they had done is they had set up some command line arguments to influence how the logging was configured.
Hmm.
And if without those flags, the logging was configured to basically swallow up most of the log messages that were created, if not all of them.
Yeah, it sounds like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it, this doesn't necessarily solve that problem, because that sounds like it's a user it's a user error problem, because you needed to know to use those flags in order to turn up the logging level in order to for your messages to even appear.
Yeah.
And so this doesn't necessarily solve that problem, because you're going to set up something similar in any case where you're setting up logging. Like, you're going to have a verbose level that you're
Yeah.
yeah, that you're going to set up. So it sounds, it's I yeah, but I understand your frustration. There are other ways that what you described can happen. uh
Hmm.
for instance, in the Voltron project, in one of the drivers, I had to explicitly go in and turn off or turn down the logging level in one of the modules that I was using, because it was logging at the debug level, and if I turned up debug level logging, I just get flooded with messages that I didn't,
Okay.
you know. But that was me in code explicitly going into and telling the logger in that module, we're going to set your level at something different. Now, if you were expecting those log messages and you're like, well, I've got to debug my message level set at debug, and this module is logging at the debug level all over the place, why am I not seeing any of those messages? You would have to go into the code and see that that's what the problem was. And
Yeah.
um
Yeah, I understand that. Like, yeah, there are codes where I also turn down or the logging information because sometimes it is too much, and of course for production runs it's not a good idea to print a lot of things on in like print a lot of log output because it slows down your program. So yeah,
absolutely.
you always run into these um, where you have to make a decision like how much log output is good enough or how much we should print out.
Yeah. So this takes a little bit different approach to to it still has the logging level setup. So a normal user of Loguru would probably disable the default logger out of the box, and then based on like command line parameters would go in and say, okay, I'm going to add a new sync. Maybe add back in the one that goes to standard error, but I'm going to set the log level differently because the default one defaults to debug. And so we would go in and you'd say, okay, based on like something similar, those command line flags, I would remove the default sync and add in a new sync that's set at the appropriate logging level based on my settings. So that wouldn't change, but so that's how you would get similar behavior to what you often see using the standard library. Now, one of the things that it does differently is you can the modules themselves have control over whether or not their stuff is logged. They have the ability to enable or disable their own internal logging. And the way that they do that, so I called remove here, but you can also enable and disable loggers. So I'm going to say my sync. And instead of removing it, I can go let me, you know what, let me look at the documentation to make sure that I'm doing this right. There we go. Okay, so what you would do is you would disable so you would set up logging in your module using Loguru. You would set it up, so you would configure it. So I've got some handlers that I want to set up, like I'm going to log to standard out, and that kind of stuff. So you can configure a bunch of syncs. But then what you can do is in a library, you can say logger.disable and give your library name so that you've explicitly disabled logging within your module. So and then if somebody wants to see the log messages out of your module, they would explicitly enable it. And it's kind of like adding a filter on the messages within that module. So it's a little bit different. Let's see. So let's go to the so if you create a library that's going to be imported and you use Loguru, you want to disable yourself by default. And then if somebody wants to enable log messages from your module, they would call enable and give it in your module name. And then if you want to enable all logging everywhere, you just pass in an empty string. So yeah, so that's considered good practice, is to explicitly disable logging in your module for somebody else to come back and turn it on. it is compatible with standard logging. You can create logging handlers from the standard library logging module and then add them as a sync, and it will just do the right thing. Let's see, if you need to propagate Loguru messages to the standard library, you can use this boilerplate code to do it. I kind of wish this was built into Loguru to where you can just say, or if there was a flag that you could set that just says, hey, go ahead and push this to the standard logger, standard library logger, so that people who are using standard library logging will their messages will just work. You can also capture standard library logging messages and forward them to a Loguru sync. So if you're using a library that is using the standard library logger and you want to see those log messages, you can add this logging handler that just emits its records into the Loguru logger automatically. Yeah. So again, these things are something that I kind of wish were a little bit more integrated into Loguru itself, to where you could just flip a switch and have it do it magically. But currently, that's not the case. It's not much boilerplate, but it is still boilerplate that we could probably get rid of this, because I mean, if it's something that you're literally going to copy verbatim right into your code, in these two cases, there's really no reason it can't be built into the library itself. But I have a feeling that that's coming, but I can't say for sure. There might be legitimate reasons why it's not already integrated. So, okay. Are there any questions? Okay, if not, we'll call it a meeting. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Kyle.
You're welcome.
Thanks.